In the heart of Nyanza village, where golden fields of maize swayed with the wind and the river whispered ancient songs, lived a young woman named Zola. She was known far and wide for her breathtaking beauty, skin as smooth as river pebbles, eyes like the midnight sky, and a smile that could make even the elders pause in admiration. Yet, despite her beauty, Zola had one great flaw: she was lazy. While other young women in the village woke up at dawn to fetch water, grind maize, and prepare meals for their families, Zola remained curled in her sleeping mat, dreaming of a life of ease. Her mother, Mama Esh, was a strong and hardworking woman who had spent her entire life ensuring her family was well fed and respected in the village. She would shake her head each morning as she found Zola still asleep while the village was already bustling with activity. "Zola, wake up. The sun is high, and yet you have done nothing," Mama Esh scolded. But Zola only stretched lazily and smiled. "Mother, why should I worry? One day, a rich and handsome man will marry me, and I will never have to lift a finger." Mama Esh sighed, looking at her daughter with sorrow. "Beauty may open doors, my child, but wisdom and hard work will keep them open." But Zola never listened. The village whispers. Word of Zola's laziness spread across Nyanza village. Some young men admired her beauty from afar, but none dared to approach her for marriage. The elders shook their heads, saying, "A woman who does not know the ways of a home will bring shame to her husband." Even the other women in the village would whisper when Zola passed by, carrying her mirror instead of a water pot. "Look at her. She thinks her beauty alone will feed her." But Zola did not care. She spent her days adorning herself, staring at her reflection in the river, and dreaming of a life where she would never have to cook, clean, or work. A final warning. One evening, after a long day of work, Mama Esh called Zola to sit beside her. "Daughter, I have tried to be patient, but you refuse to listen. If you do not learn how to care for a home, you will suffer in the future." Zola laughed lightly, brushing off her mother's words. "Oh, Mama, you worry too much. I am beautiful. Men will line up to marry me. And when I am married, I will have many servants to do everything for me." Mama Esh shook her head in disappointment. "Zola, you are like a flower in the dry season, beautiful but withering. Without wisdom, your beauty will mean nothing." But Zola only sighed, pretending not to hear. She had no idea that soon, life would teach her lessons she would never forget. One fateful morning, as the village market bustled with traders and the aroma of roasted maize filled the air, a wealthy stranger arrived in Nyanza village. His name was Damu, a prosperous merchant who traveled across lands, trading goods from distant kingdoms. He was tall and strong, with deep brown skin that gleamed under the sun, and his robes were woven from the finest fabrics. The villagers gathered around him, eager to sell their wares and hear stories from his travels. But it wasn't the crowd or the lively chatter that caught Damu's attention, it was Zola. She stood near a fruit stall, adjusting the golden bangles on her wrist, her beauty glowing like the morning sun. Unlike the other women, who carried baskets of food or jugs of water, Zola carried nothing but her pride. Damu watched her, intrigued. He had seen many women in his travels, but none as captivating as Zola. He approached her with a charming smile. "Greetings, beautiful one. Are you the goddess of this village, or is my heart simply deceived?" Zola blushed, unused to such direct flattery. "I am no goddess, but perhaps I was meant to be one," she replied with a playful tilt of her head. The village women whispered among themselves, watching with wide eyes as Damu and Zola spoke for hours over the next few weeks. Damu visited the village often, bringing Zola gifts, necklaces of polished stones, silk scarves, and tiny bottles of scented oils from distant lands. Zola was ecstatic. She paraded through the village, showing off her new treasures, proving to everyone that her beauty had indeed secured a rich suitor. Her mother, Mama Esh, watched in silence. She had seen the way Damo's eyes glowed with admiration, but she also saw something else, a hidden expectation, a test of character. One evening, she took Zola aside. "Daughter, before you rush into this marriage, remember, marriage is more than gold and gifts. A wife must know how to build a home." But Zola laughed, dismissing her mother's concerns. "Mama, why do you always worry? Damo loves me. I will have servants to cook, to clean, to do everything. I will never have to lift a finger." Mama Esh sighed, feeling a deep sense of unease. Soon, Damo asked for Zola's hand in marriage, and the village celebrated with a grand feast. The drums echoed through the hills, and the women of the village danced under the moonlight. The elders gave their blessings, and Zola, dressed in the finest red and gold cloth, felt like a queen. She had won. She had secured a rich and handsome husband, just as she always dreamed. As she sat beside Damo, watching the firelight flicker in the night, she whispered to herself, "Now, I will never have to work again." She did not know that her true test was just beginning. The morning after the wedding, Zola woke up with a smile, stretching lazily in the soft silk sheets of her new home. The house was far grander than her mother's hut, wide wooden beams, intricate carvings on the walls, and thick woven rugs that muffled every footstep. She sighed in satisfaction. "This is the life I was meant for." But her fantasy was soon shattered. As Zola walked into the main hall, Damo was already seated, waiting for breakfast. "My love, I am starving. Please, make something simple, just some maize porridge with honey," he said, stretching with a yawn. Zola froze. "Make? You mean, you want me to cook?" she asked, bewildered. Damo chuckled. "Of course. A wife takes care of her home, doesn't she?" Panic crept up Zola's spine. She had never cooked a meal in her life. At home, her mother had done everything. She had always ignored her mother's lessons, believing she would never need them. But now, her husband was waiting. Hesitantly, she entered the kitchen, staring at the pots, the firewood, the sacks of grain. Everything looked foreign and complicated. Zola guessed her way through, spilling water, burning her fingers, and nearly setting the firewood ablaze. After what felt like an eternity, she managed to scoop some porridge into a bowl and place it before Damo. He took one bite and immediately spat it out. "Zola! What is this?" "It tastes like mud," he exclaimed, pushing the bowl away. Zola's face burned with embarrassment, but she forced a smile. "It's just a different style of cooking," she said weakly. Damo didn't argue. But he did not eat. The days passed, and Zola's shortcomings became more obvious. She couldn't cook, she couldn't clean, and she had no idea how to manage a household. Damo, who had once looked at her with admiration, now watched her with growing disappointment. One evening, after yet another disastrous attempt at making dinner, he sighed and stood up. "I will eat at my mother's house tonight." Zola's heart dropped. When he returned, he didn't say anything, but she could feel the change between them. The warmth, the affection, it was fading. The villagers began whispering, and soon, Damo's mother paid a visit. She sat across from Zola, shaking her head. "A woman who does not know how to care for her home will lose it." Zola folded her arms, pretending not to care. "Damo married me because I am beautiful. He never said I had to cook." But her mother-in-law only chuckled, a knowing smirk on her face. "We shall see, my dear. We shall see." And with that, she left. That night, Zola sat alone, staring at the untouched meal she had made. For the first time, fear crept into her heart. Was she really at risk of losing everything? The days turned into weeks, and the tension between Zola and Damo grew heavier. Damo stopped asking Zola to cook. Instead, He would leave early in the morning and return late at night, carrying food from the market or eating at his mother's house. Zola tried to ignore it, but deep down, she knew things were not the same anymore. At first, she told herself, he will get over it. I am still beautiful. He still loves me. But she couldn't ignore the signs. The long silences at night. The way Damu barely looked at her anymore. The whispers of the villagers, what kind of wife cannot even cook for her husband? A wake-up call from Mama Reni. One evening, as Zola sat alone on the veranda, staring at the empty plates and cold firewood, a familiar figure approached. It was Mama Reni, the village elder. A wise, old woman known for her stories of wisdom and sharp tongue. She sat beside Zola and sighed. "Child, do you know the tale of the foolish woman who lost everything?" she asked. Zola shook her head, staring at the ground. Mama Reni leaned closer. Once, there was a woman named Sophia. She was beautiful, like the full moon in the night sky. She married a rich man, believing she had won the greatest prize. But Sophia was lazy. She refused to cook, to clean, or to care for her home. Zola shifted uncomfortably. Mama Reni continued, her voice calm but firm. Her husband, at first, tolerated it. But soon, he began to look elsewhere. He spent more time outside, eating the food of other women. And one day, he never returned. Zola's heart skipped a beat. "Do you know what happened to Sophia?" Mama Reni asked. Zola swallowed hard. "What?" The old woman's eyes burned with wisdom. She was left alone. No husband. No home. Just her reflection in the water, which, in time, faded with age. And by then, she had nothing left. Zola felt a cold shiver run through her. Was she becoming another Sophia? That night, Zola couldn't sleep. Damu had come home late again, barely acknowledging her presence. She stared at the ceiling, replaying Mama Reni's words in her mind. A woman who does not know how to care for her home will lose it. Her mother had warned her. Her mother-in-law had warned her. And now, the village elder had warned her. For the first time, doubt crept into Zola's heart. Had she made a terrible mistake? Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered to herself. I don't want to lose my home. I don't want to lose Damu. But the question remained, was it too late to change? The next morning, Zola woke up before the sun for the first time in her life. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for certain, she had to change. She could no longer pretend that Damu would always stay just because she was beautiful. The fear of becoming like Sophia, the foolish woman from Mama Reni's story, haunted her. Taking a deep breath, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The village was already alive with the sound of women pounding millet, fires crackling, and the aroma of breakfast filling the air. Zola's stomach twisted in nervousness. She had spent her entire life avoiding these chores. But now, she had to face them. And so, she did something she never imagined herself doing. She walked towards the home of Mama Joho, the best cook in the village. Mama Joho was an older woman, known for her delicious meals and sharp tongue. When Zola knocked at her door, the old woman narrowed her eyes in suspicion. Oh, look who it is. The girl who walks like a queen but cannot even boil water. What do you want? She asked, folding her arms. Zola swallowed her pride and spoke softly. Mama Joho, please teach me how to cook. The old woman raised an eyebrow. You. The girl who once said she would never touch firewood. Now you want to learn. Zola felt her face burn with embarrassment, but she nodded. Yes, Mama Joho. I need to learn. The old woman stared at her for a moment, then let out a deep chuckle. Well, at least you finally have sense. Come in. The first day was a disaster. Zola burned her hands trying to light the fire. She poured too much salt into the soup. She cut onions so badly that Mama Joha had to snatch the knife away from her. "You hold a knife like you're fighting a lion," the old woman scolded. The other young women in the kitchen laughed behind their hands, but Zola forced herself not to run away. Her fingers ached, her feet were sore, and her pride was crumbling into pieces. But she kept coming back. Each morning, she forced herself out of bed, and each day, she learned something new. She learned how to stir a pot without burning the food. She learned how to make soft, fluffy rice. She even learned the secret to her mother-in-law's favorite dish. For the first time in her life, Zola felt a strange sense of pride, not in her beauty, but in her effort. One evening, after weeks of practice, Mama Joha placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of her. "Now, make this yourself, from start to finish." Zola's hands trembled as she picked up the ingredients. She cut the vegetables carefully, just as she had been taught. She seasoned the broth, tasting it every few minutes. She watched the fire, making sure it wasn't too hot. And finally, after 2 hours, she presented the soup to Mama Joha. The old woman took a slow, deliberate sip. She smacked her lips, nodding. Then, she set the bowl down and looked Zola in the eye. "It is not perfect, but it is not poison either." Zola gasped. That was the closest thing to a compliment that Mama Joha had ever given her. She felt tears prick her eyes, not from frustration, but from relief. For the first time, she had made something with her own hands. That night, Zola cooked for Damu. She didn't tell him she had been learning, she simply placed the bowl before him and waited nervously. Damu raised an eyebrow but took a bite. He chewed slowly, his face unreadable. Then, to Zola's surprise, he smiled. "This isn't bad," he said, taking another bite. Zola felt something warm bloom in her chest. It was a small victory, but it gave her hope. For the first time since their marriage, they ate without tension, without disappointment. Zola glanced at Damu, and for the first time in weeks, she saw a spark of admiration in his eyes. It was not for her beauty, but for something much deeper. Something earned, not given. And in that moment, Zola realized she was finally on the path to becoming a woman of worth. In the weeks that followed, Zola's transformation became undeniable. She no longer woke up late or spent hours admiring herself in the mirror. Instead, she woke before sunrise, tying her hair back and heading to the kitchen, where she carefully chopped vegetables, stirred broths, and learned the delicate balance of spices. She burned fewer dishes. She wasted fewer ingredients. And she no longer feared failure. Damu noticed the changes, how their home, once cold and silent, now smelled of warm meals and carried the laughter of a wife who was learning. But not everyone was convinced yet. One evening, Zola made a bold decision: she would invite Damu's mother for dinner. This was a risky move. Her mother-in-law, Mama Kesai, had been one of her harshest critics. "That girl is only good for looking pretty. She cannot run a home," she had once said. But Zola was no longer the same woman. She spent the entire day preparing a feast. She made a steaming pot of jollof rice, flavored with rich tomato and spices. She grilled tender pieces of chicken, marinated just right. She prepared a warm vegetable soup, the one she had perfected under Mama Joho's teachings. As she placed the food on the table, her hands trembled slightly. Would it be enough? Mama Kesai arrived, her face stern as ever. She sat down, eyeing the food with suspicion. Then, slowly, she picked up a spoon and took a bite of the rice. Silence. Zola held her breath. Mama Kesai chewed slowly, then took another bite, and another. Finally, she looked up, her sharp gaze meeting Zola's. "This is better," she admitted, her voice begrudging. Zola felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't glowing praise, but it was a step forward. Damu, sitting beside her, smiled proudly. For the first time, his mother did not look at Zola with disappointment, but with something closer to acceptance. Word spread across the village. The same people who once whispered, "Zola is useless," were now praising her growth. Women who once laughed at her now asked her for advice on seasoning food. Even Mama Joha, the strict old cook, patted Zola on the shoulder one day and muttered, "You're not completely hopeless after all." Zola laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Her marriage grew stronger, too. Damu ate at home every night. He stayed longer after dinner, sharing stories with Zola. He looked at her with admiration, not just for her beauty, but for the woman she was becoming. One evening, as they sat together, Damu took her hand and said, "You have changed, Zola. And I am proud of you." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. For the first time, she realized that love wasn't just about being admired, it was about being a partner, a pillar in a home. And she had finally learned how to be one. Months passed, and Zola's transformation was complete. She was no longer just the beautiful girl of Nyanza village, she had become a woman of wisdom, strength, and skill. Her home was filled with warmth, her marriage was built on respect, and her reputation had changed from shame to admiration. But Zola wasn't satisfied with just changing herself, she wanted to help others too. One morning, Zola stood at the village square, watching young girls chatter and laugh, their hands empty of work, their dreams filled with the same illusions she once had. She saw herself in them, believing beauty alone would secure their future. And so, she made a decision. She approached Mama Joho, her old teacher, and said, "I want to teach the young women of our village what you taught me." Mama Joho nodded approvingly. And so, Zola began teaching. Every morning, young women gathered at her home, learning to cook, to clean, to manage a home. She taught them not just recipes, but the lessons she had learned the hard way. She told them, a wise woman builds her home. A lazy woman watches it fall apart. At first, some girls laughed, but many stayed, eager to learn. And soon, her small group grew into a movement. Women from other villages came, eager to learn from the girl who had once been the laziest in Nyanza, but had now become its greatest teacher. One day, as Zola was teaching a group of young women how to knit dough, a familiar figure stood at the entrance. It was Mama Esh, her mother. Her eyes glistened with pride as she watched her daughter, once so stubborn, now a leader among women. When Zola turned and saw her, her heart swelled with emotion. She rushed forward and fell into her mother's arms. "Mama, I finally understand everything you tried to teach me." Tears filled Mama Esh's eyes as she embraced her daughter. "I always knew you would find your way, my child," she whispered. Zola smiled through her tears, feeling the weight of her mother's love and belief in her. That evening, when Zola returned home, she found Damu waiting for her, a proud smile on his face. "I have a gift for you," he said. He led her to the courtyard, where a beautiful clay pot sat in the center. Zola looked at him in confusion. "What is this?" she asked. Damu took her hands and said, "This is for you. To start your own small restaurant. You are no longer just my wife, you are a woman who can stand on her own." Zola gasped, overwhelmed with emotion. She had once dreamed of an easy life, but now, she had earned a life of fulfillment and purpose. She threw her arms around Damu and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." Zola's reputation spread beyond Nyanza village. People came from far and wide to taste her food, to listen to her wisdom, to see the woman who had transformed herself from a foolish girl to a woman of worth. One day, an elder from another village approached her and said, "Tell me, Zola, what is the secret to happiness?" She smiled, thinking of all she had learned, and said, "Happiness is not in beauty, nor in riches. It is in wisdom, in hard work, and in the love you build with your own hands." And with those words, her story became a legend, one that mothers would tell their daughters for generations to come.